Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on any purchase over $10. See the description below for details. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and it's that time of the week again to go over the results of the big tournaments that occurred over the weekend. We'll be looking to see what happened at the Star City Games Dallas events, and those include the Star City Games Open, which was a standard event. There was also a Standard Classic and Modern Classic event. And we will also check in on MagicFest Toronto, look at the results of the big Modern event that occurred there. Now, as always, we're going to take a special look at the cards from Ravnica Allegiance that performed well this weekend. Quickly before we get started, though, just a fast reminder, if you check out the description below, there's some ways to help support the channel down there. Our Patreon page is there. You're also going to find links to products on Amazon. And finally, Flipside Gaming, when you use that promo code to save money, you also help us out. So as always, thank you not only to the folks that look at those links, but to each and every one of you. You all make the channel what it is. So thank you. And let's get into it. We'll begin, as we always do, a standard. Here are your top 8 decks from the Star City Games Open. Coming in first, as well as 6th place, Mono Blue Aggro. 2nd place, Esper Control. 3rd and 5th place, Azorius Aggro. 4th place, Simic Nexus. 7th place, Rakdos Midrange. 8th place, Sultai Midrange. Let's take a look at some of these deck lists. Here's your first place Mono Blue Aggro deck. Players that have stuck with this deck for a couple seasons now, finally getting rewarded. I mean, this deck looks amazing with some of the new contributions from Ravnica Allegiance. We'll look at those in just a second. But the core of this deck really hasn't changed. You still have 4 Tempest Djinns here. You're going to find 4 copies of Siren Stormtaker, 3 Mistcloaked Herald, 4 Merfolk Trickster. You got your Ops in here, 4 Wizard's Retorts, 3 Charted Course. So, overall, the deck looks familiar, but what's pushing this deck now? One of the big cards, Pteramander. This card is amazing in this deck. Essence Capture playing a role here too. Typically with these decks, you'll find some amount of these between the sideboard and the main deck. And out of the sideboard this week, a little bit of new tech with Fairy Duelist. I saw a couple of the high-performing decks this week running this out of the sideboard. As per Control, 2nd place. The deck looked amazing last weekend, still looks amazing this weekend. This particular version running 4 copies of Teferi. You also have a Warrant and Warden in there. Just 1 copy, though, in the main. And you have a lot of control spells. Many of them are new. We'll look at all those in just a second. But some of the ones that have been sticking around for a while are things like Chemist's Insight. You have Negates in here. You're going to find Search for Azcanta, of course. Thought Erasure. Let's look at some of the new cards, though. Cry of the Carnarium makes it into the main this week. Kaya's Wrath. Probably the best reason to go Esper Control over some of the other variants right now. That card is awesome. Precognitive Perception. Absorb is here. Mortify. Warrant and Warden, like I mentioned. Godless Shrine and Hallowed Fountain. Out of the sideboard, Basilica Bellhaunt and another copy of Kaya's Wrath. 3rd place is Azorius Aggro. I love the diversity we're seeing here. Top 3 different decks. Still all very powerful decks that can put up some big results at any given time. This particular deck will look familiar to you if you played with or against the mono white deck last season, or that quote-unquote Boros version of it, which was still kind of a mono white deck for the most part. Sometimes red cards would come in out of the sideboard. Once in a while, you'd find a Boros card in the main, but for the most part, they were very similar. Now, why do I want to run blue in this? Well, we'll look at a new card that makes me feel like it's worth it in just a moment. But aside from that, let's look at the core of this deck again. The unchanging cards, things like Benalish Marshal, I mean, that's a key part of this, obviously. Adanto Vanguards are here. 4 Legion's Landings, 4 History of Benalias. Let's see what's joining us from Ravnica Allegiance, though. Deputy of Detention. Pretty good reason to go blue here. Unbreakable Formations here as well, and Hallowed Fountain. Out of the sideboard in this build, you'll find Dovin Grand Arbiter. Simic Nexus comes in 4th place. We're going to look at a few different Nexus decks today so you can see the variety of what types of these Nexus decks exist. But all of them are doing pretty well. It doesn't seem to matter which variant you're running. This one in this particular tournament happened to come in 4th place. So obviously when we look at these decks today, there's going to be certain core cards that will be repeating. 4 Nexus of Fate in this version, 4 Root Snare, 4 Search for Azcanta, for example, right? However, this one is not running Teferis. This one is going more with the creature suite, and these creatures are from Ravnica Allegiance. So let's take a look at those as well as some of the other new cards. Frilled Mystic is one of those creatures. The other one, the almost omnipresent nowadays, Hydroid Krasis, we'll be talking more about that card later too. Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, a big reason to want to play a Nexus deck nowadays. Breeding Pool, and Simic Guild Gates here too. Out of the sideboard, a copy of Biogenic Ooze. 7th place, Rakdos Midrange. I'm happy to see this for the Rakdos players. This color combination wasn't performing really well over the first couple weeks, but this time we're seeing in the top 8 a Rakdos Midrange deck. Later on, when we look at the classic results, we'll also be looking at a Rakdos Aggro deck, but this one brings you some larger creatures, things like Rekindling Phoenix, 4 of those, 3 copies of Siege Gang Commander. Of course, you're going to have your 4 Goblin Chain Whirlers, why not, right? Also, a copy of Karn Scion of Urza in the main, that's worth noting. 3 treasure maps are here, you're going to find a couple Shocks of Banefire in the main, 4 Lava Coil. Let's look at those new cards. Rixmati Reveler, great card here. Carnival and Carnage is also in the main, and Blood Crypt. Out of the sideboard, Drill Bit and Theater of Horrors. 8th place, Sultai Midrange, another deck that's been performing great, although it should because it was the Golgari deck last season and it was performing great then too. Now, why do I want to put blue in my Golgari deck? There's one creature that makes me really want to do that. Of course, we'll look at it in just a second. Many of these decks are also running a copy or 2 of Hostage Taker nowadays. You see 1 copy of that in the main here. But a lot of familiar faces if you've played with or against Golgari Midrange. 4 Jadelight Ranger, 4 Llanowar Elves, 4 Merfolk Branchwalkers, 4 Wildgrowth Walkers, couple Assassin's Trophies, couple Vraska's Contempt. You see what we're doing here. Also, 3 copies of Vivian Reed, which is pretty standard for the most part, 2 to 3 copies in these builds. Also, though, 1 copy of Vraska Golgari Queen. You're not seeing that card run quite as much nowadays in these builds, but this copy of the deck is running one. Okay, here's your Ravnica Allegiance cards. Incubation Druid is here. The card I was alluding to earlier, Hydroid Crisis and Breeding Pool. Out of the sideboard, Cry of the Carnarium. Okay, let's move beyond the top 8 with a few other interesting decks that placed well. Here's the Temur Drakes deck coming in 14th place. So why do I want to put green in my Is It Drakes deck? Well, you probably already know the answer to that, right? And it's a card we've been talking about all day. We'll get to that in just one second. Aside from that, though, a lot of cards that you would find in the Is It builds of this type of deck. Crackling Drake, 4 of those. You're going to find 2 Nib Mizzet parents in the main here. Your cheap spells, Opt, Shock, Lava Coil, so on and so forth. Let's look at the new cards. Pteramander. These have been looking great in the Is It builds as well. And you notice this particular build isn't running Phoenix. It's running Pteramander instead, basically. Some Drake decks run Phoenix, some don't. They both seem to be pretty successful. But the big card here, aside from Pteramander, of course, is Hydroid Crisis again. Breeding Pool's also here in Stomping Ground. Alright, Sultai Climb came in 15th place. Kind of a variation of the Golgari/Sultai midrange deck. This one is going a little deeper, though, into Sultai colors with things like Hadana's Climb, obviously, hence the name. But you'll definitely find some other differences here, too. Let's talk about some similarities first, though. 3 Hostage Takers this time, but you're also going to find things like Jadelight Ranger again, Llanowar Elves, Merfolk Branchwalker, 2 Vivian Reeds. Here are your Ravnica Allegiance cards, though. Growth Chamber Guardian is here, Incubation Druid, of course, Hydroid Crisis, Zagana Utopian Speaker makes it, and Breeding Pool. This particular version of the deck didn't have new cards in the sideboard, but I have seen other versions running Frilled Mystic out of the sideboard. The one that came in 16th place of the Classic was doing that. 17th place was Is It Drakes. I just wanted to show you that the Is It variant of this deck is still good too. This one's running 4 Crackling Drakes, 4 Enigma Drakes, and your cheap spells. What's new? Pteramander, of course, and Blood Crypt. Now, typically, these decks will run the Blood Crypt in case you want to play the Dispersal side of Discovery Dispersal at some point. Second verse, same as the first. This time in 18th place, we're going 4 Color Nexus as opposed to the Simic one we saw earlier. So why do I want to add colors? Well, red will give me access to things like Ral Is It Viceroy and Expansion Explosion, for example. The white will give me access to Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, Settler Wreckage. There's some good reasons to try to go in this direction. Now, unlike the Simic one, which was trying to win right out of the gate with a creature suite, this one is being a little more controlling with Teferi, Hero of Dominaria lock as a potential win condition. Ral could also be a win condition for you. And aside from that, even an Expansion Explosion could get you there. So there's different ways to win game 1 with this deck compared to the one we looked at earlier, but the core is still the same. 4 Nexus of Fate, 4 Root Snare, a couple Search for Azcanta in there, and more control elements. Here are the cards from Ravnica Allegiance. Absorb is here, Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, of course, Breeding Pool, and Hallowed Fountain. 19th place, Bamp Midrange. Another direction you can go, which is actually pretty unique when you look at this deck list here. You see a lot of the powerful cards we have been talking about, But there's a lot of new cards in this deck too. We'll look at those in just a second. I do want to point out first, though, 2 copies of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria in this particular build. And here's a lot of the new stuff. 2 copies of Dovin Grand Arbiter in the main. You also have Hero of Precinct 1, Growth Chamber Guardian, Deputy of Detention, Frilled Mystic, Depose and Deploy, Warrant and Warden, Breeding Pool, and Hallowed Fountain. Another copy of Dovin Grand Arbiter in the sideboard. Okay, let's move on to the Star City Games Classic event. Now, this is a smaller event than the Open, but as you can see here from the top 8, we're actually seeing a number of different decks. Azorius Aggro came in first and second, though. 3rd place, Bant Nexus. 4th place, Mono Blue Aggro. 5th place, Mono White Aggro. 6th place, Nexus of Gates. 7th place, Bant Reclamation. 8th place, Esper Control. Alright, let's take a look at some of the decks that we did not see in the Open. 3rd place, Bant Nexus. 3rd verse, same as the first. Alright, so what's the difference now between this one? Well, not a whole lot. This time you don't have Raw or Expansion Explosion available to you, but you do have 3 Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. And then that core is still intact. 4 Nexus of Fate, 4 Root Snare, 3 Search for Azcanta. And here's your Ravnica Allegiance cards: Precognitive Perception, Growth Spiral, Depose and Deploy, Wilderness Reclamation, Breeding Pool, and Hallowed Fountain. Out of the sideboard, Deputy of Detention. Mono White Aggro, 5th place, and this is very similar to the Azorius Aggro deck we already looked at, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but you can see the similarities right out of the gate, right? Benelish Marshal, there's 4 of those here, 4 Legion's Landings. There's some big differences, though, if you compare the 2 deck lists, but overall, you're still trying to beat down the small creatures that are getting buffed. And it's also worth noting 2 Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants in the sideboard here. Let's look at those new cards from Ravnica Allegiance, though. Tithe Taker, 4 copies of this in the deck, and actually, the Azorius Aggro deck many times still runs this as well. The copy of the deck we looked at earlier was not doing so, but the one that came in 5th place in the Open was running 2 copies in the main. Unbreakable Formation also here. 4th verse, same as the first. Nexus of Gates came in 6th place. Now, yes, this is a Nexus deck again. However, this one's a little different because it is incorporating some of the strategy from the Gates decks, which I think is actually kind of cool. We'll look at the 4 of that creature in just a second. You know who's hiding there. But what I wanted to point out first was this build is different. I mean, you have 4 copies of Nexus of Fate, but then you have all these Gate Matters cards thrown in there too, like Guild Summit and Gates of Blaze. So it is doing something a little bit different at least. Alright, here's your Ravnica Allegiance cards. Of course, Hydroid Krasis, 4 of those, as I was alluding to a moment ago. Gates of Blaze, like I mentioned, Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, again, Azorius Guild Gate, Breeding Pool, Gruul Guild Gate, Plaza of Harmony, and Simic Guild Gate. Out of the sideboard, cards that complement the Gate strategy, Archway Angel and Gatebreaker Ram. Bant Reclamation comes in 7th place. Now, this is a little different than the one we looked at last weekend. The one we looked at before was trying to get big mana to kind of burn out your opponent a lot of the times. This one's a little more creature heavy. It's also running 3 copies of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. And of course, you're going to find some control elements in here too. But let's go ahead and take a look at the new cards. A lot of them. Angel of Grace is here as one of the creatures. Frilled Mystic, which is nice because it's control and a creature. Of course, Hydroid Krasis, 3 this time in the main. Absorb, Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, Breeding Pool, Hallowed Fountain. Out of the sideboard, Deputy of Detention. Okay, beyond the top 8, I wanted to look quickly at the Rakdos Aggro deck that came in 11th place. This deck is very unique compared to the mid-range deck that we looked at earlier. This is very different, going much smaller, trying to beat down fast. Here are your Ravnica Allegiance cards: Gutterbones, 4 copies of Spawn and Mayhem, Drill Bit, Carnival and Carnage, and Blood Crypt. Okay, let's talk some Modern. We're going to take a quick detour to Toronto, and here is your top 8. Grixis Death Shadow came in 1st place. Very good deck currently. Also, Grixis Whir, another strong deck, coming in 2nd place. Of course, Phoenixes had to be here. They've been great recently. Izzet Phoenix came in 3rd as well as 5th. Titan Shift came in 4th place, Golgari Midrange came in 6th, Dredge came in 7th, and Jund came in 8th. Let's look at a deck here that was running some new cards. Here's your 3rd place Izzet Phoenix deck. Now, this one is not running like the stage. Many of them are, but this particular version is not. However, there is another new card that did make the cut. That's 2 copies of Terramander in the main. So yes, Terramander has now crossed over to Modern as well. Back to Dallas for the Modern Classic. This is a smaller event, but here is your top 8. Humans came in 1st, Eldrazi-tron 2nd, Dredge came in 3rd and 7th, Titan Shift 4th, Burn 5th, Mono Greentron 6th, and Mono Red Phoenix 8th. Okay, let's look at the decks running some new cards again. 5th place, Burn, and you can probably guess what you're going to see here, of course. 4 copies of Skewer the Critics. Now, again, some Burn decks, and we saw this last week too, are running Light the Stage. This one just happens to not be running it, though. Out of the sideboard, Cindervines. Mono Red Phoenix came in 8th place. Now, this is a little more like what we were seeing last weekend. This build is running 4 copies of Light the Stage, 4 copies of Skewer the Critics. Bant Spirits. Now, this came in 9th place, but I wanted to point something out to you. Look at the very top of that creature list. What do you see? It's not a spirit, but a copy of Deputy of Detention is in here. All right, that concludes our tournament roundup. Now, later in the week, we will be doing a special edition of the Magic the Gathering Market Watch to look at Ravnica Allegiance cards and see what the price trends are now that we went through another weekend of competitive play. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible through the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.